We have now come to session 5. And I would like to remind you that we have challenged ourselves to remain as neutral inquirers. No matter what the information that is brought, we will remain as neutral inquirers and use the 4 factors we need to provide that atmosphere. So let's remind ourselves again: humility, honesty, calmness, and respect. In the last session, we looked at the theory of evolution and whether its fundamental precepts would stand scrutiny. Now we're going to look at it from another angle. Is the theory of evolution a true scientific theory? Now, to do that, we have to first establish the criteria that make any theory a truly scientific theory. So here are the criteria that people usually use. There are positive criteria and negative criteria. The positive criteria are basically 4. Number 1, relatively new concept. A scientist does not have to rehash somebody else's work. It will not be a good theory and not a true scientific theory if he does that. Number 2, it should be testable. Number 3, it should be backed by convincing evidence. And number 4, it should have predictive value. The negative criteria are those that a good, solid scientific theory should not have. There are 4 there too. The theory should not confess ignorance at critical points. Number 2, it should not use circular reasoning. Number 3, it should not express contradictory ideas. And number 4, it should not ask us to require imagination so that we can understand what the theory says. So let's look at each of those. Let's start with the positive criteria. Number 1, it should be a new or a relatively new concept. Actually, natural selection was described way before Darwin, very intelligently by a non-evolutionist according to Lorraine Isley. But this natural selection did not go on and on to form all the organisms. It just shifted one organism to its variation or to a subspecies, not just on and on. And so Darwin did come along and he did say something new. He said that these variations could go on and on, these changes could go on and on. And so the concept really is new because it's an unlimited change that Darwin described, by which one organism became all that we see around us today. How about testability? Is the theory of evolution truly testable in the scientific terms of that word? There is something known as the doctrine of falsifiability. Now, if this is complex and confusing, don't worry. You can just put it aside for now, but I will just mention it. A theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. That's what Karl Popper said, and he was known as the dean of the modern philosophy of science. He further went on to say, the criterion of the scientific status of a theory is its falsifiability or refutability or testability. In other words, a scientific theory must not only allow itself to be shown correct by the data gathered, but must also allow itself to be shown wrong or false by any of the data that was gathered. It's not that it should be shown correct, it should also be shown wrong if it is wrong. The latter, this part, is known as the doctrine of falsifiability. It requires a description within the theory of what kind of data would prove it wrong if it is wrong. That's why it is called the doctrine of falsifiability. And he described certain theories. This is Karl Popper, described certain theories. He said these theories were able to explain practically everything that happened. Whatever happened always confirmed it. Let's underline those words or bold those words. Whatever happened always confirmed it. So now you might be a little confused. So let me tell you or give you an example of a testable theory and a non-testable theory. First, a testable theory. In simple words, if I said Mr. A is progressive, and we know why he's progressive, because see, when he goes forward, he's progressive. This theory can be tested because it can be shown true if he is going forward. But if he is found to stand still or go backwards, then the theory has been proved wrong. Therefore, this theory that Mr. A is progressive can be tested. Now, a non-testable theory, almost the same words, but look at what happens here. The theory here says Mr. A is always progressive, whether he goes backwards, stands still, or goes forward. Think, this theory cannot be tested because it cannot be shown false by any conceivable data. So whether he goes forward or backward or stands still, he is still progressive. But what if he is not progressive? We cannot show that. Therefore, this is non-testable, and a theory that makes itself shown to be non-testable is not a scientific theory. Now, with that idea in mind, let's look at what some of these evolutionists have said about their own theory. And here is Paul Ehrlich and Elsie Birch, both evolutionists. Look at their confession. Our theory of evolution has become one which cannot be refuted by any possible observation. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. No one can think of ways to test it. They have become part of an evolutionary dogma accepted by most of us as part of our training. So the theory of evolution is not scientific, according to that, because it is not testable in a major way. In other words, they agreed that it's a dogma. That does not answer then to the doctrine of falsifiability. So what's a dogma? It's a claim or a statement that does not require any evidence for its support and will not tolerate any degree of questioning or scrutiny or challenge. Next, convincing data. A good theory should have enough of convincing data. But look at these two statements. One is by the late Stephen Gould. He was the professor of paleontology at Harvard University. And after looking at the information we have compared to what we're supposed to have, this is what he said. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history. Yet to preserve our favored account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. How about another sentence? Listen to this statement. When we descend to the details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. Do you know who said those words? Think. Charles Darwin himself. Really, what of that theory now? We can't even prove that one species has changed. And what about the whole classification of species to genus, to family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain? Evolution requires intermediate forms, said David Kitts, between species, and paleontology does not provide them. So we don't have the data. What about the words from Philip Handler? Some 25 major phyla are recognized for all the animals, and in virtually not a single case is there fossil evidence to demonstrate what the common ancestry of any two phyla looked like. In other words, we have these phyla, but we don't know what was before it to have given us these phyla. The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphologic transition. How about another statement by Stephen Gould? In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. So what about those little changes that brought it to its position? We don't have data on that. So demonstration of change from one species to another, which is called genealogy, parent, daughter, would require a smooth chain of intermediates linking one to the other. Here's one, and so many changes, the next one became changed a little bit, and then a little bit more, and so many generations later, well, that one had changed enough to call it another species. We have 250,000 fossil species in all the museums of the world. So we have 250,000 chances of producing chains that connect one species to another. How many chains should we have to make sure that our theory is truly a solid scientific theory? Out of 250,000 chances, how many smooth chains do we have? Do you know? Not one. Nobody knew better than Darwin what he had failed to prove. George Levine in the introduction to the book Origin of Species. There is no more conclusive refutation of Darwinism than that furnished by paleontology or the fossil record. Why? This is what Oswald Spengler says. We find perfectly stable and unaltered forms that appear suddenly and at once in their definitive shape without transition types. That is not what the theory says we should have found. Then comes something known as the Cambrian Explosion. You see, the geologic record goes from one layer to the next and to the next, and in these layers we find fossils which are progressing from the simpler forms to the more complex, and finally we have humans. That's how it went. The Cambrian Explosion describes a certain level in which the previous level had very simple, small organisms, not complex body parts. But suddenly, at the very next strata of the geologic column, we find a whole lot of phylum level organisms. Remember what I said phylum was? Way up there. Species, family, order, class, phylum. So without going through all of them, suddenly we find in this geologic strata a whole lot of phyla. Phyla, phylum level organisms. Look at what Roger Lewin said. Compared with the 30 or so extant phyla, that means those that we have here, some people estimate that the Cambrian explosion may have generated as many as 100. From a few to 100. And remember what we said about the classification? Look at that. Species, genus, family, order, class, and then phylum. The phylum level organisms in the Cambrian explosion came out of nowhere. Further, no new phylum has ever developed after the Cambrian explosion, which was supposed to have happened more than 500 million years ago. So Paul Chien says, more phyla in the very, very beginning than now exist. The whole thing turns out to be reversed. How about features of the actual data? Genetic changes are supposed to cause evolution, but lethal mutations, which are genetic changes, outnumber the ordinary ones, the visible ones, by 20 to 1. So anytime you have a good mutation, you have 20 bad ones. So which way are we going? Here's about what Herbert Nilsson said. It is therefore absolutely impossible to build current evolution on mutations or genetic changes or on recombinations, which are genetic changes too. How about the question of these changes being very, very small? By this theory of small changes, innumerable transition forms must have existed. Charles Darwin says the number of intermediates must be truly enormous. And in fact, George Levine, in describing that, says, Darwin's world, there are no permanent boundaries, and virtually every organism varies through time. He sets everything from rocks to barnacles to birds and trees in motion. In other words, this is what Oswald Spengler says. there ought to be merely transition types. That's why he had said his earlier statement, there is no more conclusive refutation of Darwinism than that furnished by paleontology. There ought to be merely transitional types, no definition, no species. Instead of this, we find perfectly stable forms that appear suddenly and at once in their definitive shape and do not thereafter evolve toward better adaptation. How about the real bits of information we now have? The fruit fly, whose geographical, biotypical, urban and rural types are now known inside out, seems not to have changed since the remotest times. Coelacanths, a type of fish, have undergone little change in 300 million years. Paradoxically, says Richard Goldsmith, all orders or families known appear suddenly and without any apparent transition. New species almost always appeared suddenly with no intermediate links to the ancestors. So the suddenness doesn't jive with the gradual picture that it's supposed to have shown. How about the fact that the changes were accumulated? Remember, we said one small change, and they went on for a little while, and another small change added to that. So now we have 2 changes and 3 and 4, and by the time 100 changes come there, we have shifted from this species to another. But in 1980, there was a very historic meeting of evolutionists in Chicago, and Roger Lewin was one of the scientists' reporters. Look at his words. The central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanics underlying microevolution, which is the change from species just to subspecies, can be extrapolated or pulled out to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution, meaning species to genus to family, order, class, phylum, kingdom. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. In other words, changes do not accumulate. And this is echoed by Francisco Ayala, who is a well-known evolutionist. This is what he says: I am now convinced from what the paleontologists, those who study fossils, say, that changes do not accumulate. How about the claim that the changes are for the better? Genetic changes do not improve organisms. Mutants, or those that have those changes, are deleterious to their carriers. In other words, those changes affect adversely. That's what the next statement says. Mutations or genetic changes invariably affect adversely. And Pierre-Paul Grassi says, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution. So fact-wise, data-wise, we are having a difficult time. How about whether there is predictive value? Here's a prediction made by Charles Darwin. No organism wholly soft can be preserved. But what do the observations show? This is a recent statement by Hagdorn. Thousands of jellyfish, totally soft-bodied, many bigger than a dinner plate, are found in at least 7 different horizons of sandstone. And so David Raup, the dean of the Museum of Natural History in Chicago, says the predictive or postdictive power of the theory is almost nil. Wow. Doesn't look like the positive criteria have been met. How about the negative criteria? Ignorance. No good scientific theory should say, I don't know. But look at Charles Darwin's own words. Our profound ignorance, he says. We know nothing about the origin of history of any of our domestic breeds. And yet that is the basis of him providing the theory of evolution when he looked at domestic breeds. And he says, we know nothing. How about his next statement? Vertebrates have descended from an ancient prototype of which we know nothing. Then how do we know we came from there if we know nothing of that? Errol White says this: lungfishes have their origins firmly based in nothing. I have often thought how little I should like to have to provide organic evolution in a court of law. And he is the president of the Linnean Society in London. That's a big evolutionary society. Circular reasoning. What is circular reasoning? It's like this. I am telling you the truth. And when you ask me, how do I know you are telling me the truth? My answer is, because I'm telling you. In other words, the place of the information is also the place of the confirmation of the information. That is circular reasoning. Look at this statement of Charles Darwin. Based on the theory of natural selection, all living species have been connected with the parent species of each genus. But connection of parent and species to daughter species is the theory of evolution. So based on the theory, his theory is correct. How about the next one? Based on the theory of descent, these characters have been inherited from a common ancestor. But ancestral factors that are gone over to the next generation is the theory. So based on the theory is correct. It would be, wouldn't it? So Agar says, we land ourselves immediately in an impossible circular argument. By making our explanation into the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis but belief. Dogmatic endeavors of this kind must eventually leave the realm of science. How about the place of contradictions? We must not state a fact and then contradict it by another statement. But look at these couples of statements by Charles Darwin. We never know the exact character of the common ancestor. And yet, another statement, we may feel sure that these characters have been inherited from a common ancestor. How can you be sure of what you never know? It is contradictory. Here's another one. The fossil evidence does not afford plain evidence of gradation, that means small changes. And yet another statement, geology, which is the fossil record, plainly declares that all species have changed in the manner which my theory requires. I don't think facts can plainly declare what it cannot show. Number 4, the question of imagination. These again are the words of Charles Darwin. It is good thus to try in our imagination to give any form some advantage over another. In other words, the advantage is not really seen, it's not really there in the data. We must supply that with our imagination. Here's another sentence. We have only to suppose their common progenitor. Why should we have to suppose? Because it is not there in the data. And once we suppose, then natural selection will account for the infinite diversity. George Levine, in the introduction to The Origin of Species, says, Darwin's imagination and his science, his imaginative science. So a lot of that is really imagination that we are supposed to use. But really, which scientific theory leans on imagination? No, scientific theories set themselves strongly on data that can be collected and that can be analyzed. So the theory of evolution does not have any of the positive criteria that a good scientific theory should have. On the contrary, it possesses all the negative criteria that a good scientific theory should not have. So it can be proposed as an idea or a proposition, but not as fact. So, we have already agreed that natural selection is a real phenomenon. But it does not produce any more variations, anything more than variations and subspecies. We have already agreed that evolution does occur. The word evolution, yes, it does occur, but it's a limited process in that species do form variations and subspecies. But the theory of evolution, which states that the changes were unlimited and involve the entire spectrum of biological classification, is highly suspect today. So, the theory of evolution really is not science, but is actually history. It's a historical construct that is thrust onto the biology of science, but it is so bad history that nobody would teach it as history in a reputable school or university. So, the theory of evolution fails as science, flops as history. And for it to rise any higher than mere speculation, here are the words of Murray Eden. It must await the discovery of new natural laws, physical, physico-chemical, and biological. Look at the title of his paper, Inadequacies of Neo-Darwinism as a Scientific Theory. So, what are we looking at? We have looked at the fundamental claims of the theory. We've looked at whether the theory can really meet the criteria of a good scientific theory, and it seems to have failed in both. Therefore, the second proposition we had made earlier, and which is more reasonable because of the information we have in our hands today, and the second proposition was this: if the theory of evolution is not scientific, then nature and its study could endorse the claim that God is essential and does in fact exist. What we are saying is that we must go where the argument leads, according to Socrates quoted by Plato. We will meet again at the next session.
If you have enjoyed this presentation with Dr. Subodh Pandit and wish to watch more of this unique 13-part series for free online, visit the website godfactorfiction.com. That's godfactorfiction.com. If you would like to order this fascinating series on DVD, it is now available from Whitehorse Media. To order from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. Dr. Subodh Pandit has written 2 eye-opening books entitled Come Search With Me, Does God Really Exist? And Come Search With Me, The Weight of Evidence, which further explore the topics of evolution, theism, atheism, and religion. To order these books from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. That's 1-800-782-4253. If you live outside the U.S., you may also easily order them on Amazon.com.